Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Sarah Rose Leonard, and I am a live events producer here at KQED. Take off the voices in my head. So for those of you joining us for the first time, KQED is Northern California's PBS NPR member station, and KQED Live is our new multi-platform events program that produces screenings, talks, performances, and food events based on KQED's mission to inspire, involve, and inform. You can learn more at kqed.org/live. So we want to thank our season sponsors that make KQED Live possible. That's the Asian Arts Museum, Berkeley Rep, Comcast Business, and Oakland International Airport, as you just saw. We are so grateful for their commitment to supporting our mission of civic and cultural engagement in the Bay Area. So tonight, we have Alexis Madrigal, a co-host of KQED's signature call-in radio program, Forum. Alexis was born in Mexico City, grew up in rural Washington State, went to Harvard, and now lives here. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, a co-founder of the COVID Tracking Project, and the author of Powering the Dream, The History and Promise of Green Technology. Please join me in welcoming Alexis. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks so much for joining us. I couldn't be more excited about this. Rebecca Solnit is someone that obviously we all know. Her work is incredible. 20 books now. Hard to believe, but it's true. Oh, she's here.
It was a little unclear.
Just an incredible writer, a serious activist, a fascinating human. I mean, I think having reread a bunch of these works in preparation for this interview, her work just is always kind of taking us to these fascinating places that we don't expect. It's connecting up people and ideas and timelines and histories in unanticipated and really, really powerful ways. I was thinking about how people love to quote you on Twitter or in quote books. You see Rebecca Solnit quotes, and it's not because the words are simple, it's because they're clear and they're profound and they're true. So thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca Solnit.
My pleasure. It's so exciting to be face-to-face with you as the voice on my radio so many mornings for so long.
It is. It's strange. I know. I'm in an incarnate form sometimes. I want to start by talking about beauty. And I want to start with this new essay that you have out about a friend's violin that was produced in 1721. And you just approach it in this beautiful way, thinking about it as a carbon sink, as a sort of production of trees, as a piece of human craft. Can you just tell us what you think this violin says about kind of our moment and the world we might have?
Yeah, it's David Harrington of Kronos Quartet's violin. He's been playing it for about 50 years. As he says, pretty athletically, he doesn't baby it. He'll play Orange Blossom special and avant-garde plucked things, and there's some thumping and stuff that happens. And Kronos did a benefit for my climate group, World Change International, in 2019, and that's when I found out the violin was going on 300, and it kind of blew me away that this, less than a pound of carefully crafted materials, mostly wood, could make music for 300 years. I just thought that was beautiful, exciting, and kind of mind-blowing in this age of disposability and overconsumption. And it really spoke to me about something that seems so important in the climate crisis, which is you can have beauty, abundance, really exquisite culture without grotesque consumption. In fact, I think grotesque consumption, is, the kind of H&M, IKEA, Walmart is pretty much the opposite of a 300-year-old violin that makes great music. And it's also just fascinating. I've learned from the visual artists I was working with in the 80s to think about meaning in materials that a violin is mostly trees. The trees in that violin were probably growing in the 17th century. They're probably contemporaries with, Cervantes and Galileo and Pocahontas. And that wood from that era is still sounding, still making music. was just kind of amazing. And the fact that a violin, now you have metal strings and you would have made it with metal tools in those days, but essentially metal strings aside, a violin is all organic materials, bits of animal and what used to be sheep gut, not cat gut strings, the horsehair in the bow, bits of insect and pine sap possibly in the varnish, but mostly wood. And that also, this kind of all organic, all renewable, was kind of fascinating. And it also let me think about trees, which is something I'm usually looking for an excuse to think about, because they always invite us to think about deeper time. And because the climate change itself is kind of a war against trees. The plant kingdom sequestered immense amounts of carbon underground, particularly in the Carboniferous, but all through to this very moment, to produce the relatively low carbon atmosphere we benefited from as we evolved, particularly, in the interglacial of the last 10,000 years. And what we've done burning fossil fuels is taken what plants put in the ground and put it back in the air, which I'm here to tell you is a really bad idea, and we need to stop. And so there's also something about the trees, the arborealness of it, that's kind of poetic and magical, and enters us in a surprising way back into that conversation about fossil fuels and extractivism versus kind of renewables and organic and trees. So all that was happening for me with the violin, and it was just a pleasure to research and write. My friend Hans Johansson is a violin maker in Iceland who I was staying with recently, and he was like my main consultant.
You got to watch him make violins?
I go into his studio, and it's the most, I know a few people, a blacksmith, some farmers, and this violin maker who make real things. Me, I just turn sentences around on a keyboard, thanks Apple, and named after a tree. But yeah, no, I actually, I've never, it would take several months to see him do it all through, but I'll see him, he's got templates for kind of cutting out the wood and these tools and materials in this kind of alchemical lab of substances for turning a piece of spruce into that, and a piece of maple into that gorgeous golden red color of violins. And, and the fact that somebody can hand make something that will function, playing music, and that he can make something with that precision also kind of blows me away, because I think most of us technically are kind of slobs these days, and he's so precise.
Well, you have that great line that even the same wood, he's sort of telling you, some of it will resonate and some won't, just the sort of depth of engagement that he has with this product of the natural world.
Yeah, and he was saying it's very hard to industrialize violin production because there are all these nuances. And I was looking with admiration at this beautiful kind of basket of templates he has that are like the outlines for cutting out violins and cellos and the various pieces of them. And he's like, I always use a template, but I also always have to improvise a little because you won't get it quite right if you just follow, the template, which is kind of instructions for everything in life. But it was kind of wonderful to hear that there's always some improv going on. And he often writes something very meaningful inside the instrument. And with David Harrington's violin, the original label that was put there in 1721 is still there, which is part of how we know what it is and when it was made. And the idea that, as Hans's wife, my dear friend Frida, said to me, maybe in 300 years somebody will be playing Hans's violins and cellos and violas, which sometimes have little political messages in them, kind of souvenirs of moments, I think maybe when the Icelandic economy collapsed or some major event overtook the world.
Yeah. I mean, even just as I hear you talk, and certainly you're doing it in the piece too, you're trying to find a way to sort of connect these individual objects to the planetary scale.
Yeah.
How have you been, obviously you've been doing that in your writing for a long time, but do you feel like when you're trying to write specifically about climate, like you have a great passage in that essay where you're describing these various woods that went into various violins and describing the parts per million of carbon dioxide that were in the atmosphere. Does it feel like a new type of writing that you're doing to try and address the scale of the climate problem?
Not really. It actually feels, I did a lot of work with visual artists in the 1980s and was often talking about their materials, about honey, beeswax, felt, wood. other organic materials and inorganic materials, this idea that there was meaning in materials. I learned a lot from visual artists. And also, you're always trying, I think as a writer, you're always trying to find a point of entry that will engage your imagination and hopefully other people's imaginations. At least if you're a political writer like I am, you know, like you can't really say like patriarchy is bad and get people to be like, yeah, okay, maybe you can.
Actually, you could do it right here,
How many of you are ready
I'm
to
sure
raise your fists?
Yeah.
But, you know, you're trying to find a specific story that resonates in other people's imaginations. I do think a lot of certain kind of American writers are always trying to depoliticize things. So they like universal humanity, but they don't really like connecting it to injustice and the fact that there isn't really universal humanity, because to be in the slums of Honduras is a little bit different than to be in a luxury tower in Vancouver. But, you know, and it's interesting. I've written a lot about feminism. I'm not sure I'll have anything new to say further, but I'll keep saying abortion is a human right, and, you know, women are people, and all those other radical ideas. But climate and feminism, you know, a lot of my feminism has been about violence, and it's visceral and personal and partly my own experience. Climate is really hard to write about because it's science and technology and these big abstractions. And even trying to get people to care about the composition of the upper atmosphere was a heroic battle that the climate movement, I think, actually succeeded in. You know, it was really hard. And it's fascinating seeing people like my friend Bill McKibben try to find points of entry into the collective imagination around climate. How do you do that? What catches people? And the violin piece was just such a joy, also because it was writing about abundance. One of the really boring and annoying tenets of conventional climate activism of the kind of Al Gore, Prius, and compact light bulb variety was that what the climate required of us was austerity. You know, that it was all about renunciation. We had to renounce stuff. And I also felt the violin invited us to think something my friend Thelma Young Lutunabua and I think a lot, which is that actually doing what the climate requires of us would enter us into an age of abundance in a way that we could see the austerity is what we have now. To not have confidence in the future is a kind of poverty. To live in a world of profound injustice and inequality is a kind of moral and spiritual poverty, even if you're not personally poor. To have the corruption and poisonousness of the fossil fuel industries impact everything we do, fuel Russia so it can invade Ukraine, corrupt domestic and international politics, destroy that hope in the future. You know, that's a poison. I'm renouncing poison is like giving yourself something luxurious. So the violin felt like it was an invitation to think that maybe the world we need to make can be more beautiful than this one, more generous than this one, more hopeful than this one. In fact, I think the only successful response to climate will be to make a better world. And in its tiny old way, David's violin kind of let me approach that, and that was really lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned your friend Thelma.
Yeah.
And you're working on a new project with Thelma. It's Not Too Late.
Oh, just not too late.
Not
but
too
yeah.
late. Not too late. And tell us what Not Too Late is.
First of all, it's nottoolateclimate.com, all run in words. And Thelma and I started talking about a year ago and realized that we had a very similar perspective, that a lot of the doomism, despair, climate grief, etc., needed to be spoken to directly. And to address it both as, you know, for its emotional content, and address it because I think it's a real handicap to doing what we need to do about climate. And so, yeah, we're nice people who want to take care of people who feel terrible. We also want to be a gateway everybody steps through to become a climate activist. And if you think it's too late, there's nothing we can do, we have no power, then you're not going to do much. And so we had various iterations of what we thought we should do. Thank God we got over the idea that we were going to join the 100 million people doing podcasts. And though we might do a lecture series. And so we started just with a website whose address I gave, social media. There will be a lecture series in the fall. And with my regular publisher of my smaller books, Haymarket, a book called Not Too Late with a wonderful subtitle I can't quite recall, but with it's an anthology with an amazing collection of voices from around the globe. And so we really wanted to address the part of that despair that's due often to misinformation or lack of information, that nobody's doing anything, we don't have the solutions, it's too late, kind of stuff, none of which is true. But there's also a kind of mindset, which is really common in the US, that a kind of defeatism that's the flip side of perfectionism that I run into all the time. I just waved the book Hope in the Dark, which was first an essay in 2003 and then this book in 2004 in response to the same kind of defeatism around the Bush administration and the war in Iraq, speaking of fossil fuels and their corrosive power in our world. And the sense that, we have no power, we never win, we have no history of victories. And I think with climate, it's very true. It often comes out of a sense that a kind of despair or cynicism that's also a form of confidence that we know what's going to happen. So much of my hope is about uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. History is full of, left curves and surprises and things that nobody anticipated. And, and optimism and pessimism are both confidence that what's going to happen is going to happen, it's inevitable, and it gets you off the hook from participating. So we're really interested in recognizing just the fact that we're making the future in the present. And this decade, the 20s, is the decisive decade for the climate. There will still be meaningful things to do as long as there are people to do them. But we're in a kind of make it or break it period where we know exactly what to do. We have all the technologies we need. The solutions have been mapped. Better technologies around cheaper, more effective, more efficient renewables, better battery storage, and better design for transportation, housing, growing food, and everything else. We have it all. We just need to overcome the obstacles, which are the vested interests, the fossil fuel corporations, and the financial backers, and the governments that serve them. So we only have a political problem. So that's some of what we're trying to lay out, is to address the emotional content, but also address the kind of factual content, because emotional content is often just based kind of tragically on inaccuracy. There's also something that I've started saying a lot, which is that I can respect despair as an emotion, but it's really dangerous to mistake it for an analysis, and I think that happens a lot.
In your book, Hope in the Dark, you really also try and develop kind of a whole theory of hope and what it actually is. We can say what it's not, but what did you try to develop in terms of what it actually is?
And it was really a series of arguments, one of which was because a lot of people feel powerless, we never win. One of which is, since you can't know the future, you can look at the past. The past shows that we have an extraordinary history of popular victories, particularly in the last 60 or so years. And I feel like not very many people, a lot of you have grayer hair than I do, might actually remember, but I find that people don't remember how radically different the institution of marriage was, the status of women was, that to be gay, lesbian, trans, any kind of gender non-heterosexual conformist was to be treated as mentally ill or criminal or both, into the 1980s and beyond, that before Silent Spring and Rachel Carson, we didn't even have a language to talk about the environment, and we had almost no regulation around water, air, toxins, etc. That, the ways that the world has changed are so huge and profound. So I wanted to tell people that. I wanted to remind them that change is unpredictable, that we have power, and really in that, that sometimes we win, we have a history of victories, and that the future is something we're making in the present. And there really is this tendency in this country. I wish I spent more time and spoke more language in other places and spoke more languages, because I don't know if people in Chile right now or in Vietnam have that kind of fatalism that the future's already been decided and there's nothing you can do about it, which is both defeatist and inaccurate. And we see it change all the time, and we see how history surprises us regularly. The invasion of, by February, the invasion of Ukraine wasn't a surprise to all of us. The pandemic was a surprise to everyone but epidemiologists and stuff. But you see the world change suddenly and unpredictably, and all the time. And you see things afterwards, like the collapse of the East Bloc countries in 1989 and then the Soviet Union in 1991. Makes sense, and people forget how completely unforeseen it was. So those were some of the major points I wanted to give people, is that, nothing is stable. Because I think another delusion that it's really easy to have is that the present is infinite. It stretches endlessly into the past and the future. And I think people who don't have much of a sense of history often think that. I've often been told over the last 25 years that feminism has failed. And my two positions on that is, first of all, trying to overcome 5,000 years of patriarchy isn't necessarily a job you should finish in one lifetime to be successful. But the main point is that if you remember that, marriage was essentially an ownership relationship in which a husband assumed huge amounts of power over his wife that was not reciprocal. Marriage equality was something women had to get in heterosexual marriage, I think, before we could even conceive of marriage equality for same-sex couples. That discrimination, Ivy Leagues didn't admit women undergraduates. So many forms of discrimination were completely not just acceptable, but official by law, by custom. Concepts like marital rape and sexual harassment, gender discrimination, even the language didn't exist. And so people don't really recognize how dramatically the world has changed. Yeah. And all with these things because people were willing to do things that didn't seem particularly likely. And it's like abolishing slavery. The small groups of people meeting in the 1840s in the US did not look like people who were going to overthrow the most, basic principles of the thriving Southern economy and change, rewrite or add new amendments to the Constitution. The Civil War was not something people saw coming in the 1840s. So I also think just remembering that most of these changes, it's very easy to think marriage equality is this nice thing the Supreme Court handed down in 2015, but it's really about not only the lawyers, including my friend Tobias, who argued the case, and the plaintiffs in the case, but it's about millions of queer people coming out of the closet to their friends, their family, their coworkers, the community, the public, to say we are here, we deserve rights, to make the case. And so those are the people, not the 9 Supreme Court justices, who give us something like that. So it's partly telling the histories that the world has changed, and partly reminding people who changed it, that the narrative, another one of the kind of deadly narratives we have in this culture is that power all resides at the top and in the center. And if you're nice, maybe they'll give you something you beg for if you're polite, rather than that. What you see with movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring and things like that, the climate movement right now for the fossil fuel industry, is that they're quite terrified of us because they know we have power and they know that we can change things. And so it behooves us to remember it ourselves.
So when we stack up all of these social wins, cultural wins, some of the, all of these different histories that you're telling, and then we look at the sort of structures of governance in the United States, and we look at the way the Senate, as time goes on, will just get less and less representative of the country. We look at what's happened with the Supreme Court. How do you hold those two realities in the same vision?
I hope doesn't mean everything will be great and turn out fine. It just means that it's worth trying wisely, not to tilt at windmills or beat your head against the wall. It does feel like the U.S. government, as constituted by the Founding Fathers, is kind of running aground with all the forms of institutionalized inequality that consists of not just the Senate, but as the population imbalance of California with its 40 million people and Wyoming with its, 1/80th our population, each having 2 senators, plus the gerrymandering and corruption and et cetera. And we, also playing out in the corruption at the Supreme Court now. And so I think that maybe, I think the U.S. is running aground in some ways, not as a public necessarily. I think the rising generation, the non-white future generation that's coming is pretty awesome, and they make me hopeful. But I think the systems are kind of grinding down. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Chile is writing a constitution right now to throw out the evil constitution Pinochet enforced on them in 1980 is a reminder that you can have a do-over. And there is this weird cult in this country of like the founding fathers as this kind of like God handing the tablets to Moses. They get treated, and actually Mormons say that the Constitution was divinely inspired and treated as a sacred document. But, pretending that it is to justify absolutely anything is what we're now seeing the conservatives on the Supreme Court doing. So, yeah, things are things are messed up here. I do not need to inform anybody in this room, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. I hope people fully participate, which is how it's going to turn out, whether it's the midterm elections, are, winning back abortion as a right if we win both houses and pass that amendment, or that, the bill that passed the House in September, that some of you probably heard about, hardly anybody seems to have, that if it passed the Senate, would make abortion a right and override the state laws. And but I also feel like a lot of the stories I get told are about the U.S. specifically and our problems, and we have huge global impact, particularly in our fossil fuel consumption, and our economic might. But the U.S. has partially just rendered abortion illegal last month. Ireland, Colombia, Argentina, and Mexico just made it legal in the last couple of years. So I often hear people trying to say what's happening in the U.S. is a global trajectory, mm-hmm. and I just think you have to look more broadly and see that it's more diverse.
Yeah. And one of the other things as we were kind of working through this book as a way of thinking about your entire sort of body of work, you describe in Hope in the Dark the emergence of what other people sometimes called the anti-globalization movement, that you called the global justice movement, and it's sort of rising kind of with the U.S. as a piece of this sort of network of players. How do you see that movement, now 20 years on, and what kind of impact it's had?
One of the things I run into all the time is narratives about stuff not having an impact. The anti-globalization movement, which I'm very proud my brother David was instrumental in, notably as the guy who decided we should shut down Seattle in November of 1999. And that actually gave the poor countries in the global south the sense that they had the backing to stand up against the rich countries. The ministerial collapsed, and the WTO, which was a kind of global corporate takeover, never got the power it was intended to have. The free trade area of the Americas completely collapsed. I was at the ministerial in Miami when it imploded. And it created also a kind of discourse, because I think indirect consequences, and if I had had a child, I probably would have named her Indirect Consequences. And her brother would have been named Marine Layer after our KQED's daily weather reports, clearing by midday for middle names. And but seriously, indirect consequences, and that movements like that, like Standing Rock, like Occupy Wall Street, among other things, their education movement. Standing Rock gave a lot of non-native people a huge amount of education about the connections between climate and fossil fuel politics and indigenous land rights, indigenous history and treaties, and sometimes indigenous culture. This movement created a lot of global alliances, made people much more aware of corporate malfeasance and destruction, which I think would be really useful for the climate movement. It created a lot of insurgency and insurrection in countries from Mexico to South Korea. And so I think it had a huge amount of impact. And you can say, Occupy Wall Street really brought about, like my friend Astra Taylor was like this wonderful young activist at Occupy who took on student debt as somebody who'd been hideously burdened by student debt herself. You know, she and a handful of other people, inspired by Occupy's discourse about our completely corrupt economy and the kind of debt peonage in which so many Americans live, housing debt, medical debt, and educational debt. The student debt movement, like, they keep kind of ratcheting up the goals, but the fact that debt abolition has partly happened already, and that they're talking about it, a kind of universal debt abolition, has really moved an idea out of the margins and shadows as something that seemed, that nobody had thought about, and then people thought was ridiculous, impossible, extreme, into something that's happening. So, but Occupy just, a few years later, I looked at all the things that were happening. So with all of these things, I think it's really interesting looking at, often there's a set of demands. Often those demands are not met. Sometimes they actually are. But, but all these ancillary things happen on other scales and other timelines as public consciousness. And people took lessons from Occupy that I think went into Black Lives Matter, that went into a lot of addressing economic injustice. The presidential campaigns in 2012, 16, and 20 definitely had a visible Occupy impact, particularly when it came to Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. But I think much more broadly, people were forced to discuss things that they weren't forced to discuss before. So I'm really interested in those kinds of, the ripples that spread outwards long after the splash from the rock has disappeared.
I think one of the things that reading about that movement again, and that was the kind of movement when I had my own political awakening. So that plucks my heartstrings for sure to read about those things. But thinking about where we are in the context of kind of the state of the U.S. state.
Yeah.
And in the book, you kind of gesture at this idea of political movements that don't actually want to take state power, but that instead want to sort of disperse state power.
Seemed like a good idea before Trump, didn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I wonder how you see that now.
Well, no idea is so good that you shouldn't trade it in when it no longer fits. Yeah. And I think that there was a moment where the kind of Zapatista, John Holiday, change the world without taking power, the kind of anti-institutional thing had some merit. And of course, the Zapatistas, 20-something years later, are still at it in Chiapas. I think we talked about it beforehand, that we're both huge fans, and they're a huge literary and kind of imaginative influence on me. But the really interesting thing Trump did is he made a lot of us who like to think that we were kind of radical and left have to become institutionalists. There are worse things than the status quo of the U.S. government as it was constituted before Trump. There's the Trump takeover, there's the attempted coup, this kind of, there really was an attempt in 2020 to stage a coup, steal an election, and then what surely would have followed was, because they had already so profoundly broken the law that if the law mattered, that they couldn't, to create a kind of authoritarianism that was accountable to no one and utterly anti-democratic. And so it is interesting having to be people who defend institutions. And it was also interesting in the Trump era to see that liberals, who get a very bad name from the left, are very comfortable defending institutions, and that a lot of, most of the early work in the Trump era was done by middle-aged women, and who were all mostly pragmatists. But to see people who think of themselves as radical to say, actually, the rule of law has its merits, that there are times you want to change the law, but when it comes to laws that protect rights, protect justice, protect democracy, you want to protect them. So it's interesting looking at, the way I think that Trump forced a lot of us to become institutionalists of the sort.
I mean, this is kind of a dark thought to share on the pub, but let's say that in 2025 we wake up and there has been, the coup succeeds this time.
Yeah.
And we don't get major institutional responses, and there's been a lot of celebration of the institutions just barely holding, thanks to people in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Republicans doing the right thing. But now most of those people are gone now. So let's say that happens. I did find some hope in those decentralized movements trying to match up against a actual real authoritarian American government. Like, that would be one strategy aside from the electoral one.
I have a newspaper clipping from 1989 of people carrying a bust of Stalin through the streets of Prague with a sign hung around his neck saying "Nothing lasts forever," in Czech, which I will benefit everybody by not attempting to pronounce. And and it's interesting looking at Republicans' short-sightedness. They basically decided to pursue goals that they cannot win through majority. Through democratic means, through majority support. The majority of Americans support abortion. They actually support pretty much the right to vote in fair elections. They support a lot of stuff the Republican Party is against at this point. And so they've really decided to pit themselves against democracy itself. And I do think that we are in a kind of pre-Civil War state. In a practical sense, I'm not sure what a civil war looks like. We're a very large country. There are countries, like you take Paris and you kind of control France. You take Madrid, maybe you control Spain. And I don't know what, if you take New York and Washington, D.C., San Francisco and L.A. will be thumbing their noses at you. It's been really great being a Californian through all this. We are the seventh... Wait, are we the fifth or... I think we're the fifth largest economy, independent of the rest of the country. We wield a huge amount of power. We have stood pretty firmly, if imperfectly, I'm looking at you, Gavin Newsom, on progressive values. And, and I loved that Kevin De Leon, the day after Trump's, election victory, such as it was in its dubiousness, issued a proclamation of defiance in Spanish as well as English. And I think that on a country this big and weird, non-cooperation, which has taken down a lot of coups, the possibility of it is, and there's lots of people who want to use violence, but how many people are you going to kill, and what does it look like, and how does it give you a legitimate government? And I found the storming of Congress on January 6th both completely horrific and somewhat ridiculous. And if they'd actually hung Mike Pence and assassinated Nancy Pelosi and suspended the vote counting, did they think the American people and the governments of the world were going to recognize that Trump won because of a bloodbath? It was all these kind of lunatics in Dockers having their fantasies that violence is power, when violence is always, as Hannah Arendt and Jonathan Shell like to put it, really a sign of weakness, something you deploy when you have lost the other means to affect your agenda. So I don't know what it would look like. And I do think it's quite possible. I think we have to prepare against it by getting as many people engaged in supporting free and fair elections, being alert to all the warning signs, the terrorist groups, that the white supremacist terrorist groups that have formed, etc. But I just, and I will not be surprised if there's an attempt. I don't know what their version of success looks like, because I cannot see how they get legitimacy and how they hold it. And even, the 1,000-year Reich lasted for 13 years, and I feel like the Soviet Union lasted for 70, but, that anything, and the US has lasted a really long time as governments go, that anything they try seems to have a short shelf life, in part because we're going to be a non-white majority country in 20 years, and they've committed themselves to white supremacy, which isn't going to make you that successful in a non-white majority country. So, thank you, younger generation.
Yeah. And South African apartheid fell too. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was a system set up through colonialism where a white minority could have power over a non-white majority. I don't think it can be replicated here. And I think it's great that people read Octavia Butler and Margaret Atwood and George Orwell and take the warnings from them, but I don't, and I'm not being totally hopeful. I think that there's a lot of economic inequality and climate chaos that we're facing in the present, let alone the future. And, it's not all going to be sunny and easy. But I do think, and I also think that we have to take the fact that they want an authoritarian regime achieved through illegitimate means extremely seriously. The one part of it is I just can't see what their success looks like.
Yeah. Want to let you all know you are going to get a chance to ask questions. There should be some note cards, and we have Sarah who's going to come around. If you have one, I see somebody with a question here, and she's going to sort them for me, good from bad. I'm sure they're all going to be good, but just in case there's any bad ones, she's going to weed those ones out, and we'll get to them. You mentioned Orwell, and I did want to talk about Orwell's Roses.
Oh, yay.
A fantastic book. And I wanted to talk about the way that you describe, beauty and awe and wonder, not just as sort of like next to your political commitments or Orwell's political commitments, but actually sort of intertwined with them.
Yeah. No, the book began when I ran across the roses Orwell had allegedly planted in 1936. And I'd kind of known he'd planted roses, but seeing these rose bushes, which may or may not be his, as it turns out, but, in person, kind of blew me away and made me think, what does it mean that our great, serious anti-fascist was also lovingly and enthusiastically tending roses really throughout his adult life and otherwise was an avid gardener? And the fact that Orwell himself made a lot of room for pleasure and beauty and these other activities in his life both modeled kind of, I think, what a sustainable life of resistance can look like. Because I've seen a lot of activists feel like you must throw yourself into it 24/7 until you burn out and become bitter and burdensome to everyone around you. But
Not
also,
just hypothetically speaking, yeah. Yeah.
I could name names and movements. But it also spoke to a much more nuanced sense of what politics are. I think one thing Orwell did that's important for all of us, that while he was very clear what he was against, authoritarianism, fascism, injustice, lies, and propaganda, Stalin, Hitler, he never forgot what he was for, that he was defending ideas of people's right to a decent life, and that included literature, pleasure, beauty, leisure, the privacy in which to enjoy those things rather than having them dictated by the state. And authoritarian regimes will be, you can read this poet, but this poet we're putting in prison and nobody can read him. And as they're doing in the Soviet Union and Belarus and various other places now. But also, one of the wonderful phrases I came across researching the book, a phrase we all know, but I had never really investigated, was bread and roses, coined by Helen Todd on a suffragist speaking tour in 1910 in Southern Illinois, in one of her talks, trying to argue for the vote when women were getting it state by state before we got it nationally in 1920, speaking of things changing. And it was actually the servant girl at the farm, which seemed to only have women on it, that she was staying at, who picked out the phrase, and that really turned it into a catalytic phrase for both the labor movement and the women's movement, bread and roses. And as Todd articulated it, it was a very clear demand that not only are we fighting for bread, which is the basic stuff to sustain life in the practical sense, the kind of food, clothing, shelter, living wages, decent working hours, but we're fighting for roses, and that meant beauty, pleasure, art, nature, culture. And I just love that these radicals, in a time when most people in this country were very poor and working, often 6, 12-hour shifts a week, were really insisting on beauty and pleasure and culture and nature. And I think it almost brings us back to the violin, to the rights of nature, and et cetera. And it's something Orwell was very cognizant of. He defends in his writing in various ways the natural world, taking pleasure in it. He wrote a whole series of essays in 1946 in which you can see a kind of warm-up as he's getting ready to write 1984, in which he celebrates the ordinary pleasures that would be available to almost everyone. A lot of it is nature, English food, racy postcards, good, bad books, the pleasure of wandering in junk, these kind of gritty blue-collar junk shops and things like that. And he himself is ardently, at that point, moving to the Isle of Jura in the Hebrides to start a much more ambitious garden than the one where I saw his roses that he started in 1936. The way he starts 1984 is he writes all these essays about pleasure, but in which you can see crucial traces of 1984 taking place. And then he goes and creates a garden that is part of food garden. Orwell was kind of a, back to land, do-it-yourselfer, believe it or not. In the time of rationing and post-war poverty with his young son, he was setting out for some place with better air than London and where they could produce a lot of their own food, where the quality and quantity of food was really scarce. And they ended up with chickens, lots of vegetables, potatoes, ultimately 2 cows, a fishing boat, lobster traps, and did this kind of amazing job of it. And it was kind of great turning Orwell, who's always portrayed as this very grim, austere figure, into somebody full of enthusiasms and pleasures. And I felt it was specifically because he is kind of your quintessential old dead white guy. And one of the people I find most inspiring right now is Adrienne Marie Brown, and then there's the black woman who has what she calls the NAP ministry and stuff. I think there's a lot of queer people and women of color advocating for these things Orwell advocated for, but I think they also get dismissed because of who they are. And Orwell Orwell felt like a perfect person to pin the argument on. And it also let me look at the other side of Orwell, which is being a great anti-fascist and doing something very subtle and complex, not just looking at what authoritarianism and fascism consist of, but what it does to consciousness, and how what we need to defend is the complexity and freedom of imagination, the depth of thought. One of his great sentences is that imagination, like wild animals, does not breed in captivity. And so a lot of what I think he was very aware of was that we needed to defend freedom in a positive sense by relishing it, celebrating it, understanding it, not just by fighting bad things. And I think also one of the things he reminded me is that propaganda tells you what to think, but good art helps you become a thoughtful person who may think your own thoughts. So there's a kind of art that isn't propaganda, but I think, and so it's not just telling you fascism is bad, but it's making the kind of robust, thoughtful, independent-minded, aware person who might be better at resisting fascism, because a lot of what Orwell's interested in and what he portrays his character Winston Smith in 1984 is doing is resisting the regime by having an inner life, by cultivating memory, emotion, his trusting your own perceptions, etc. So I was interested in all that in the book, to try and put it in a nutshell.
Finally getting us gardeners our due as anti-fascists, too. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, in a time of climate crisis, plants are our great allies in fighting it, and gardening also has, even though your small garden is not actually going to sequester that much carbon, but protecting forests, regenerative farming, topsoil, grasslands, all the rest of it is very much part of what we need to do.
Well, to return to trees here at the end before we get to these questions, in Orwell's Roses, you also describe this great sounding Orwell essay about planting a tree. And in part, your kind of explication goes to that it changes people's sense of time.
Yeah.
Why is that an important thing to have happen politically?
Again, I've been joking that I feel like a tortoise at a mayfly party, not just because I'm now 61, but because, I remember as I was saying to you in the green room, that if the arc of change is long, you better have a long memory to see that arc. You don't see change in 1 year or 2 year increments. You might need decades, or sometimes you need centuries to see it. And trees, I think, are just constant reminders of deep time. The old trees, the big trees, the trees that we in California are almost more than any place else in the world have as bristlecones, sequoias, redwoods, some of our great valley oaks and black oaks. etc. And just to be with something that stood fast for, 2,000 years is really to be invited in a way, the way the telescope did yesterday, to think about deep time. Not quite that deep, but still. There are trees in Muir Woods just across the Golden Gate that are 1,300 years old. And it's not that shocking for us to think about the year 700 AD, but you flip that and start thinking about the year 3300 AD, and that's pretty radical. A redwood sapling planted today, if we don't screw everything up, could be standing in, the year 3322. And so that sense of deep time I find really valuable. Sometimes it feels like relief from the kind of pettiness of human affairs in this very moment. Sometimes it feels like a sense of responsibility, but it's always this kind of context, and just the trees as kind of sentinels and guardians is a feeling I always have about these upright forms in the landscape. And as a Bay Area girl, I grew up particularly with oaks, bays, and buckeyes, and the redwoods a little bit less, but have a real personal attachment too. And to Mary Ellen Pleasant's eucalyptuses over there in the Fillmore, planted by, San Francisco's least recognized, civil rights hero, who we should name lots of stuff after, but that's another conversation. What did they ask?
Let's see here. Okay, let's go here. One of my worst memories of the Trump administration was the White House Garden Party celebration of negating the Paris Climate Accord, replete with military music bands. How can climate progress enthusiasts join ranks to work constructively with the U.S. military?
I'm not sure. Well, the U.S. military, like the intelligence agencies, is really interesting because part of their job is to know what's really happening. And so they're very aware of climate change and that it's going to create a lot of chaos. And it doesn't mean that I trust them or think they make the right decisions. It drives me nuts that we spend billions of dollars to defend ourselves from largely imaginary threats when that money put against the real threats around poverty, disease, and climate chaos, environmental destruction, habitat loss, etc., would be far better spent. But it is really interesting to me that the military, the CIA, et cetera, really grasp the climate crisis and think hard about it and how that's going to affect geopolitics.
Yeah. In a nutshell, what is not too late about fighting climate change? What's the roadmap for it?
You mean what not too late is going to do, or
for what not too late is going to do? Yeah.
And it's a very small intervention. Thelma has a day job, and I have some other things to do too. But right now, it's a website, social media. It'll be the book in the spring, and we'll both be talking about it. We're hoping to do a lecture series later this year, and just really be available. One thing I've seen a lot is that scientists are often being sort of besieged with people who are deeply distressed and not very informed. And scientists are neither therapists nor people who should have to do the job of basic education over and over. So we keep saying, send them to us. This is what we're here for. So we're hoping to just provide a kind of backbone like that. And and the project may merge into something else, may outlive its necessity if we feel that other people are doing more of this work. I feel like everybody's acknowledging climate grief, as it usually gets called, although I think despair, cynicism, defeatism, I think there's a lot of different varieties. Grief is one of them. But then they usually start trying to address it as emotions, or they just acknowledge it. The fact that it needs to be linked to actually addressing the cause of it, which is that we're not doing enough about climate, I think doesn't happen quite enough. So we're trying to do both. And then we also think that a lot of it comes out of lack of information or poor information and, inaccurate information. And there's been a kind of plague of guys who have not been paying attention to climate, then suddenly read up on it, decide that it's very bad, and pop up with bestsellers telling everybody that they're doomed. And it really annoys climate organizers and scientists and et cetera. You can read Michael Mann and a lot of other people taking them on. And, and that's been a source of a lot of people feeling really defeated. So,
can you tell people what you're going to write for the anthology?
actually wrote an essay on indirect consequences, which started as a letter to the people in the Sunrise Movement who felt because the Green New Deal hadn't passed, it hadn't succeeded, but it's like the template for Build Back Better, Biden's platform, for and it's like, we don't have that much time because I could tell you all the amazing things. The Green New Deal completely changed the conversation, raised the ambition, broke the divide between jobs and the environment, and did a bunch of other awesome stuff. So I'm doing an essay on indirect consequences, an essay looking at 2023 when the book will come out from 1973, which has been really fun. And it's about the fact that nobody could have imagined how different the world would be 50 years ago. Thelma's going to do the opposite and look back imaginatively from 2073 to 2023 with a kind of how we got here. So, and then lots of other people, Adrienne Marie Brown, lots of people from the South Pacific. Thelma's based in Fiji and very connected to the climate movement there. My friend Red Constantino, who's a climate organizer in Manila. All these amazing people are writing for the book, and so it felt, we needed lots of voices to cover lots of grounds. A bunch of scientists, Jacqueline Gill, Edward Carr, who was one of the IPC scientists.
Yeah.
So,
we have a lot of other climate and political questions, but there's one that's more about writing. Can you speak to the effect of technology on the imagination? Let me give this example of autocorrect choosing your words for you. Not for you, for one.
For us.
Well, can you speak to that? Do you think about that?
And autocorrect drives me nuts because it's racist. I'm like, when I type Latinx names, they constantly get corrected over and over on both my phone and social media. And although I suppose it has its uses. But I do think, and it's interesting what we mean by technology. I think that, are we talking about word processing in Microsoft Word? Are we talking about the corruption of our attention spans and what we focus on by social media? There's so many different pieces to it. And I do feel that it's a real tragedy that a lot of the most powerful parts of our lives from Silicon Valley became free market advertising driven invasions of privacy. I think that search engines and social media should have been essentially nonprofit, kind of global commons operated for the public good. And we got something very different. That's deeply...
Sergey Brin and Larry Page kind of agreed with you at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and then they walked away with their tens of billions and stopped agreeing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Strange. Let's see. This question says, will we need to dismantle the value system that keeps extractive and exploitative capitalism in power in order to fight the climate crisis? How can it happen when even, quote, progressive San Francisco is ruled in service of money?
I actually think that that's happening. There's a tendency on the left to say we need to start doing something, and I usually feel like that, those seeds have always been planted. They need to be watered, cultivated, and et cetera. And I think that the change in consciousness is broader and deeper than any one movement can change. Our basic ideas about gender, about nature, about equality and justice, about human rights, about animal rights and the rights of nature, about so many things. We think so much more systemically, ecologically, and socially from the kind of very isolated, compartmentalized way we thought. The huge success of things like Suzanne Simard's The Mother Tree, the excitement about the sort of rhizomatic world of fungi and things like that. People, the return. When I was a young woman, I had that terrible California fourth grade education where you didn't actually learn about the 100 different native California languages, the rich cultures and cosmologies, et cetera, at all. There was like some missions and sugar cubes. And, the return of indigenous cultures to prominence leading the climate movement in many parts of the world. 25% of the indigenous-led movements have prevented 25% of the fossil fuel that would have otherwise been extracted in the last 10 years from being extracted. But a more indigenous set of ideas, the transformation of ideas by Buddhism, kind of non-Western ideas and indigenous ideas, I think in the last few decades has been really astounding. And it's all subtle and complex. I think a lot of people don't realize how different our thinking is than it was not long ago. But I think it is. So I think the work is underway, and I'm not just talking about North America, and yet, in Europe, in Asia, and of course there are places where people don't need to change their thinking because they're already indigenous, majorities. But it's a sort of toppling of a kind of hyper-rationalist, white, colonial set of values that can be as literal as tearing down Columbus statues, as subtle as how we describe nature, in our scientific and literary work.
Let's give you one last question. In your writing, you leave room for uncertainty. That's a bold step in the world today. And I'm going to just bounce off of this question, thank you, Greg, to ask what you're most uncertain about right now as you look out into the dark.
Oh, everything. Myself, the fate of the country, whether we'll get it together to do enough of what the climate requires of us. I'm uncertain about everything. I think certainty about the future is usually false, and that we just get surprised over and over again, and things don't happen the way that people assume they will. And so I'm kind of wide open to what's going to happen. I'm not going to believe ridiculous things that's grounded in some sense of probability and possibility. But within that, I think the range is pretty wide. And also, as always, that it's up to us. And to close with something that more or less comes from Terminator 2. She keeps saying versions of the future is not yet written. So, let's write it. Let's write it as well as we can.
Oh, well, thank you for your work. Thank you for your writing. Rebecca Solnit, everyone. I think we get to run away now.